The morning sun rose over New Haven Colony as Captain Lisa Martinez walked across the landing platform and checked her watch for the third time in 10 minutes and felt nervous energy building in her chest because today would bring visitors from beyond the stars. The Valdorian ship descended through the clouds like a silver dream, and its hull gleamed with patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the light, and Lisa had never seen anything so beautiful or so alien, and she wondered what these beings wanted from humanity. Ambassador Kalen, Starweaver, stepped from the ship with grace that made Lisa think of flowing water, and her silver hair caught the morning light like spun moonbeams, and her blue eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of wisdom and experience that no human could match. The elvish woman wore robes that seemed woven from starlight itself, and when she spoke her voice carried music that made the air itself seem to sing, and she smiled with warmth that reached her ancient eyes and said that her people came in peace and friendship. Lisa led the delegation to the colony meeting hall, where Governor Buffeth Williams waited with the other officials, and they all stared in wonder at these beings who looked like legends come to life and moved with elegance that seemed impossible for any living creature. Colleen spoke of the Valdorian Empire and how they had brought peace and prosperity to 40 different worlds across the galaxy, and how they sought to share their wisdom with younger species like humanity and help them reach their full potential among the stars. The ambassador described worlds where war and hunger no longer existed, and where technology had advanced beyond human dreams, and where different species worked together in harmony under Valdorian guidance and protection, and Lisa felt hope blooming in her chest. Meanwhile, in the communications center, Amy Clark sat at her console and listened to the translated conversations between the Valdorians and the human officials, and something bothered her about the way certain words seemed to have multiple meanings in their language. The Valdorian language used terms that could mean both guidance and control, and both protection and subjugation, and Amy frowned as she noticed these patterns, but decided she might be reading too much into simple translation errors. Back on the distant world of Ithermore, High Counselor Lirelei Moonwhisper stood in her crystal palace and gazed out at the floating cities that drifted among the clouds like jewels, and felt satisfaction at the perfect order of her domain. Her advisor Zara Vexai entered the chamber with quick steps, and her purple-scaled skin gleamed in the ethereal light, and her golden eyes showed concern as she carried reports from the intelligence division about the humans. Zara had once led the armies of the Nexari people before they joined the Empire, and she understood warfare and conquest better than most, and she warned Lyra that humans showed unusual patterns of behavior that might complicate their integration. The Nexari general explained how humans had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that would have destroyed other species, and how they showed remarkable ability to adapt and overcome seemingly impossible challenge. Zillalei dismissed these concerns with a wave of her elegant hand and reminded Zara that the Empire had successfully absorbed 40 different species over 3,000 years, and humans would be no different from the others. The High Counselor explained that every species thought themselves special and unique at first, but they all eventually accepted the wisdom of Valdorian leadership and the benefits of joining their galactic. On New Haven, the negotiations continued through the day as Kalen presented the terms of the Galactic Prosperity Alliance and explained how humanity would benefit from Valdorian technology and protection and wisdom. The Alliance agreement promised shared knowledge and peaceful cooperation and mutual defense against hostile forces and economic prosperity beyond human dreams, and Lisa felt excited about the possibilities. Governor Williams asked careful questions about human autonomy and self-governance, and Kalen assured her that member species retained full control over their internal affairs while benefiting from imperial guidance on galactic matters. Amy Clark continued monitoring the communications and noticed that Valdorian ships had appeared at the edge of several human systems, but when she reported this, the ambassador explained they were simply diplomatic escorts, ensuring safe passage. The signing ceremony took place as the sun set over New Haven, and representatives from Earth government participated via hologram link, and President Helen Carter herself appeared to witness this historic moment. Helen Carter spoke about humanity stepping forward into a larger universe, and about the hope for peaceful cooperation between species and about building a better future for all children. Human and alien Ella Kalin, Starweaver, signed the documents with graceful movements, and her pen seemed to glow with inner light. As she wrote her name in flowing Valdorian script, and smiled warmly at the human officials, Lisa Martinez felt pride and excitement as she watched history being made and imagined human children learning from alien teachers and human scientists working alongside Valdorian researchers to unlock the secrets of the universe. The celebration lasted late into the night with music and food from both cultures, and the Valdorians seemed genuinely pleased to welcome humanity into their alliance, and spoke of great things to come. But in her quarters, Amy Clark worked late into the night, analyzing communication patterns, and trying to understand why something felt wrong about the beautiful promises and elegant words. She discovered references to previous alliance members and how they had been integrated into Imperial society, and how their home worlds had been transformed according to Valdorian standards. The communications officer found mentions of species that had resisted integration, and how they had been guided toward better understanding through firm but fair correction programs. Emmy tried to contact these previous alliance members, but found that their communication networks had been restructured and now operated through Valdorian relay systems that filtered all messages. She attempted to access historical records about the 40 species that had joined before humanity, but discovered that most of their original cultures and languages had been preserved only in Imperial museums. As dawn broke over New Haven, Amy Clark sat at her desk with growing dread, and realized that humanity might have just signed away their freedom to beings who saw them as children to be guided rather than equals to be respected. Meanwhile, Kalin Starweaver prepared her ship for departure and sent coded messages to Valdorian fleet commanders, informing them that the humans had accepted the alliance terms exactly as predicted. The ambassador felt satisfaction at another successful integration, and looked forward to helping guide humanity toward proper civilization, and away from their primitive and chaotic ways. Back on Ethermore, Lirale Moonwhisper received the news with pleasure, and instructed her administrators to begin preparing integration protocols for human worlds, and to assign cultural advisors to help reshape human societies. Vakes High watched the preparations with growing unease, and remembered how her own proud people had signed similar documents before discovering what integration really meant for species who refused to abandon their independence. The Nexari general said nothing but began reviewing intelligence reports about human military capabilities, and population centers, and strategic resources, because experience had taught her that some species required more persuasion than others. As the Valdorian ship departed New Haven, Lisa Martinez stood on the landing platform and watched it disappear into the morning sky, and felt hope for the future, mixed with a strange sense of foreboding. She could not explain. Amy Clark printed out her analysis of Valdorian communications, and prepared to present her concerns to Governor Williams, and hoped that someone would listen before it became too late to change course. The documents had been signed, and the alliance had been formed, and humanity had taken its first step into a larger universe without realizing. They might have walked into a trap that had been 3,000 years in the making. 6 months had passed since the signing ceremony, and Captain Lisa Martinez stood on the bridge of her patrol ship, watching Valdorian peacekeepers establish checkpoints around Titan Edge Colony, and felt her stomach tighten with each new restriction. Elegant alien soldiers moved with fluid grace as they installed scanning equipment and monitoring devices, and explained to confused colonists that these measures were necessary for protection against hostile forces in the Regent Colony. Administrator Nancy Brooks tried to protest the new security protocols, but the Valdorian commander, Elf Ann Silverwind, simply smiled and showed her the Alliance Agreement section that granted Imperial forces authority to ensure member world safety. Lisa watched helplessly as families were questioned about their daily activities, and business owners were required to register their operations with Valdorian oversight committees, and children were enrolled in cultural education programs. The peacekeepers spoke of bringing order to chaotic human settlements and teaching proper civilization to a species that had much to learn about galactic society and living in harmony with other races. Dr. Maya Rodriguez had been studying at the Valdorian Science Institute on Ethermore for 4 months and felt privileged to work alongside researchers whose knowledge spanned centuries and whose technology seemed like magic. The crystal laboratories floated among the clouds and contained archives that held the accumulated wisdom of 40 different species, and Maya spent her days learning about genetic engineering and stellar mechanics and dimensional physics. But late one night, while researching human cellular biology, Maya discovered files that made her blood run cold and contained detailed studies of every species that had joined the Valdorian Empire over the past 3,000 years. The records showed how each new member species had been gradually transformed through genetic modification and cultural reprogramming and economic dependency until they became perfect citizens of the Empire. Maya found documentation of the Alvaros people who had been tall and proud warriors before joining the Alliance, and were now docile farmers who barely remembered their warlike past. She discovered records of the Zenthari merchants who had controlled trade routes across 3 sectors before integration and now worked as clerks and administrators under Valdorian supervision. The files contained detailed plans for human modification, including proposals to reduce human aggression through genetic therapy and to eliminate their tendency toward independent thinking through educational reforms. Maya tried to send a warning message to Earth, but discovered that all communications from the institutes were monitored and filtered through Valdorian security systems. She attempted to contact other human students, but learned that several had already been transferred to special residential programs for species that showed resistance to proper integration. And Ithermore High Counselor Lirelei Moonwhisper reviewed reports from human worlds and felt growing concern about resistance patterns that differed from previous integration experiences. The humans were not responding to cultural guidance programs as expected and continued to maintain their chaotic social structures and individualistic behaviors. Despite clear instruction about proper civilization, Lael summoned her military advisor, Zaravex High, and expressed frustration about human stubbornness and their refusal to accept the wisdom of beings who had successfully governed the galaxy from millennia's era. Had been expecting this conversation and brought detailed analysis of human resistance patterns and explained how they differed from the 40 species that had been successfully integrated before. The Nexari general pointed out that humans had evolved as persistence hunters and survivors and had developed psychological traits that made them extremely difficult to pacify through normal means. She showed Lirelei historical records of human conflicts and how they had fought against impossible odds and continued resisting even when facing certain defeat and never seemed to accept permanent subjugation. Zara explained that her own people, the Nexari, had been similarly stubborn at first, but had eventually been broken through targeted strikes against their leadership and key population centers. The High Counselor listened to these reports with growing irritation and decided that stronger measures would be necessary to help humanity understand their proper place in the galactic order. Back on Earth, President Helen Carter received disturbing reports from colony worlds about increasing Valdorian control and restrictions that seemed to go far beyond the Alliance agreement. Terms Governor Beth Williams sent encrypted messages describing how Valdorian peacekeepers were taking over essential services and requiring permits for basic activities and separating families for educational purposes. Amy Clark had compiled extensive evidence of communication, interception, and cultural suppression and presented her findings to military intelligence officers who began investigating Valdorian activities. The analysis revealed that every human world in the Alliance was being systematically monitored and controlled, and that resistance to Valdorian guidance was being met with increasingly harsh corrective measures. Carter called an emergency session of the Global Defense Council and presented evidence that humanity had been deceived about the true nature of the Valdorian. Empire Admiral Kate Sullivan reviewed intelligence reports and realized that ships had positioned themselves at strategic points throughout human space and could blockade or attack any world that tried to withdraw from the Alliance. The President sent a formal communication to High Counselor Lyra Ley requesting clarification about Valdorian policies and expressing concern about the treatment of human citizens. Ley responded with elegant words about the necessity of guidance for young species and the importance of accepting proper civilization and the benefits of imperial wisdom. She explained that resistance to integration was a natural phase that all species experienced, and that humans would eventually understand the value of Valdorian leadership. President Carter consulted with her advisors and decided that humanity needed to assert its independence before the situation became irreversible. She sent a formal notice to the Valdorian Empire stating that humanity was withdrawing from the Galactic Prosperity Alliance and requesting the immediate removal of all imperial forces from human worlds. Dr. Maya Rodriguez finally managed to smuggle a message to Earth by hiding it in routine scientific data, and warned about the genetic modification programs and the fate of previous Alliance members. Her message reached Admiral Sullivan, who immediately began preparing human defense forces for what seemed like an inevitable conflict with the most powerful empire in the galaxy on Ithamor. Lyra received the human withdrawal notice with surprise and anger and could not understand how a primitive species could reject the generous offer of imperial guidance. She consulted with Zaravex High, who had predicted this outcome and now recommended immediate military action to correct human misconceptions about their status in the galactic hierarchy. The High Counselor authorized the deployment of the Third Imperial Fleet under Admiral Theron Nightblade, with orders to restore proper order to human space era, prepared her Nexari auxiliary forces for deployment, despite feeling uncomfortable about forcing another proud species into submission. She remembered her own people resistance and how they had fought desperately to maintain their independence before being overwhelmed by superior Valdorian technology and numbers. Captain Lisa Martinez received emergency orders to evacuate civilian populations from border colonies, as long-range sensors detected massive Valdorian fleet movements toward human space. The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency, but Lisa knew that running away would only delay the inevitable confrontation with an empire that had never been successfully resisted. Amy Clark worked frantically to establish secure communication networks that could operate without Valdorian interference and to coordinate resistance efforts across human worlds. Admiral Sullivan gathered the Earth Defense Fleet and prepared for a war that most experts believed humanity could not win against an enemy with 3,000 years of conquest experience. President Carter addressed the human population via emergency broadcast and explained the situation and called upon every citizen to resist the Valdorian attempt to subjugate humanity. She spoke of freedom and independence and the right of any species to determine its own destiny, and promised that humanity would fight rather than accept slavery disguised as a Lion Star. Maya Rodriguez escaped from Ithamor aboard a smuggler ship and carried with her detailed intelligence about Valdorian military capabilities and weaknesses. Her information reached Admiral Sullivan, who began developing strategies that might give humanity a chance against seemingly impossible odds. High Counselor Lyra Ley issued a final ultimatum to humanity demanding immediate surrender and compliance with Imperial integration protocols. She warned that continued resistance would result in corrective action and that human suffering could be minimized through prompt acceptance of Valdorian authority. President Carter rejected the ultimatum and formally declared that humanity would defend its freedom against any force that sought to enslave them. Stage was set for a conflict that would determine whether humanity would join the 40 species that had been absorbed into the Valdorian Empire, or become the first to successfully resist imperial conquest. The Valdorian Third Imperial Fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of human territory, with the same overwhelming force that had conquered 40 civilizations, and Admiral Theron, Nightblade, felt confident about this routine pacification mission. Ships moved in perfect formation, with crystalline hulls that sparkled like diamonds against the void, and weapons that could shatter planets, and shields that had never been breached by any enemy. Force Captain Lisa Martinez watched the enemy fleet approach from her position aboard the destroyer HSS Defiance and counted 200 Valdorian warships against 30 human vessels, and knew the odds were impossible. Something burned in her chest that had nothing to do with logic or strategy, and everything to do with the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Admiral Theron opened communications with the human fleet and spoke with the same elegant condescension that had intimidated countless species into surrender over the millennia. He offered humanity one final chance to accept Imperial guidance and avoid unnecessary suffering, and explained that resistance would only lead to greater corrective measures. Admiral Kate Sullivan responded from the command ship HSS Liberty with words that surprised the Valdorian commander and contained no fear or pleading for mercy. She told Theron that humanity rejected his offer and would fight to defend their freedom and independence, and that the Valdorian Empire had made a serious mistake in threatening human worlds. The battle began with Valdorian ships advancing in classical formation and firing precision strikes designed to disable human vessels without destroying them completely, but the human ships scattered like startled birds and attacked from unexpected angles, using tactics that made no sense. According to Imperial military doctrine, Captain Martinez led her squadron in a desperate charge against the Valdorian center, and her ships absorbed terrible punishment, but kept fighting even when systems failed and hulls cracked. The destroyer HSS Courage rammed a Valdorian cruiser when its weapons failed, and both ships exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the battlefield. Admiral Theron watched in confusion as human ships continued fighting even when facing certain destruction, and seemed to prioritize inflicting damage over their own survival. He had never encountered an enemy that fought with such reckless determination, and whose crews chose death over capture or surrendered. The battle raged for 6 hours with human ships using suicide tactics and coordinated swarm attacks that overwhelmed Valdorian point defenses through sheer audacity. Captain Martinez watched the cruiser HSS Valiant overload its reactor and detonate inside a Valdorian formation and destroy 3 enemy ships in the explosion. She felt grief for the lost crews, mixed with fierce pride at their sacrifice, and knew that every human death was buying time for the colonies to prepare their defenses. Admiral Sullivan coordinated a fighting withdrawal that cost the Valdorians twice as many ships as they had expected to lose. In the entire campaign, her fleet limped back toward Earth's space, leaving behind wrecked vessels and fallen comrades, but having proven that human courage could hurt even the mighty Valdorian Empire. And Ethermore, High Counselor Lirelay received Admiral Theron's battle report with disbelief and anger, and could not understand how primitive humans had inflicted such casualties. She demanded an explanation for the tactical failures, and questioned whether her forces had underestimated human military capabilities. Zaravex High reviewed the battle records and pointed out that humans had used tactics that prioritized maximum damage over self-preservation, and showed no concern for acceptable loss ratios. The Nexari general explained that most species fought to survive and would retreat when facing impossible odds, but humans seemed to fight harder when the situation became hopeless. She warned Lirelay that conventional tactics might not work against an enemy that viewed death in battle as preferable to slavery or subjugation. Meanwhile, Dr. Maya Rodriguez had reached Earth and presented her intelligence about Valdorian technology and empire structure to military researchers working around the clock. Her information revealed weaknesses in Imperial shield systems and power distribution networks that human engineers began designing weapons to exploit. The research teams worked with desperate urgency, knowing that the Valdorian Empire would not remain patient much longer after the unexpected resistance. Sami Clark established a secure communication network linking all human worlds and coordinated intelligence sharing between military commanders and civilian resistance groups. Her broadcasts carried news of the first battle and proof that Valdorian forces could be hurt and that humanity still had a chance to maintain their independence. Admiral Sullivan regrouped the Earth Defense Fleet and incorporated lessons learned from the first engagement into new tactical doctrines designed specifically for fighting Valdorians. Knew that conventional warfare would eventually lead to human defeat, but unconventional tactics might create opportunities that Imperial forces would not anticipate. Captain Martinez received command of a new squadron equipped with experimental weapons designed to penetrate Valdorian defenses and trained her crews in suicide attack formations. The human military began preparing every available ship and station for total war, with the understanding that defeat would mean the end of human-list civilization. President Helen Carter addressed the population again and spoke honestly about the challenges ahead and the sacrifices that would be required to maintain freedom. She announced the Total War Protocol, which mobilized every human resource for the defense effort, and called upon civilians to support military operations however possible. On Ithamore, Lirelay consulted with her council about the unexpected human resistance and decided that stronger measures would be needed to correct their misconceptions about Imperial power. She authorized Admiral Theron to use planet-killer weapons, if necessary, to demonstrate the futility of continued resistance. The High Counselor believed that destroying one human world would convince the others to accept Valdorian guidance and end the costly rebellions. Arvex High felt uncomfortable with these orders, but prepared her Nexari forces for deployment as part of the next assault wave. She remembered how her own people had fought desperately against impossible odds before being crushed by Imperial might, and wondered if humans would suffer the same fate. Dr. Maya Rodriguez worked with human scientists to develop countermeasures against Valdorian genetic modification programs and to protect human DNA from Imperial interference. Her research revealed that the Empire had used biological weapons against resistant species in the past, and that humanity needed to prepare for attacks. Beyond conventional warfare, Admiral Theron regrouped his fleet and received reinforcements, including auxiliary forces from conquered species, and prepared for a second assault on human space. He studied human tactical patterns and developed strategies to counter their unconventional warfare methods and prevent further embarrassing losses. The Valdorian commander issued new orders prohibiting enemy ramming attacks and requiring the capture of human officers for interrogation. About their psychological conditioning, he could not understand why humans fought so differently from other species, and wanted to study them before implementing final pacification measures. Captain Martinez prepared her squadron for the next battle, knowing that each engagement brought humanity closer to either freedom or extinction. She trained her crews in advanced ramming techniques and overload detonation procedures, and made peace with the knowledge that they might not survive the Wormy Clark intercepted Valdorian communications about planet-killer weapons and immediately warned all human worlds to prepare for the worst possible escalation. Her intelligence network coordinated evacuation plans and resistance preparations as humanity braced for an enemy that was running out of patience. Admiral Sullivan received reports that Valdorian reinforcements were massing for a decisive assault and knew that the next battle would determine the fate of human civilization. She prepared her fleet for what might be their final stand and prayed that human determination would prove stronger than Valdorian technology. The second battle was approaching, and both sides knew that it would be larger and more brutal than the first, with the future of humanity hanging in the balance. High Counselor Lirelay authorized the use of any force necessary to end human resistance and restore proper order to the galaxy. The Valdorian Empire was about to discover that some species would rather die fighting than live as slaves, and that humanity was unlike anything they had ever encountered before. The agricultural world of New Harmony died in fire and radiation as Valdorian planet-killer weapons turned 12 million human lives into ash, and Admiral Theron Nightblade watched the destruction with grim satisfaction. He had hoped that demonstrating Imperial power would convince remaining human worlds to surrender, but the response exceeded his worst expectations about this stubborn species captain. Lisa Martinez received the emergency broadcast from New Harmony Orbit Station in the final moments before the weapons struck, and heard the desperate voices of families who would never see another sunrise. She watched her homeworld burn from space as evacuation ships tried desperately to rescue survivors from the orbital cities, and felt something break inside her chest that would never heal again. The footage of New Harmony destruction reached every human world within hours, and Amy Clark broadcast the images across all networks to ensure that no one could ignore what the Valdorian Empire had done. Mothers wept as they watched children die in the flames, and fathers swore oaths of vengeance that echoed across human space and united the species in a way that nothing else could have. Accomplished President Helen Carter stood before the Global Assembly with tears streaming down her face as she declared that humanity would never forgive and never forget what had been done to innocent civilians. She announced Total War Protocol 7, which mobilized every human being from military service and transformed the entire species into a weapon pointed at the heart of the Valdorian Empire. Admiral Kate Sullivan watched the New Harmony footage and felt her heart turn to ice as she realized that this war could only end with the complete destruction of one side or the other. She gathered her fleet commanders and spoke words that would echo through human history about the price of freedom and the cost of letting tyrants believe that fear could conquer the human spirit. The Admiral revealed humanity's secret weapon project that had been developed during months of apparent peace, when Valdorian attention was focused on integration rather than military preparation. The HSS Retribution emerged from asteroid mining facilities as a dreadnought-class warship built with reverse-engineered Valdorian technology and human engineering innovations. Captain Martinez took command of the Retribution and felt the power of weapons designed specifically to kill Valdorian ships and break through their supposedly impenetrable defenses. Her crew consisted of survivors from New Harmony and other attacked colonies who had nothing left to lose except their desire to make the enemy pay for every human life. Meanwhile, on Ithermore, Dr. Maya Rodriguez led a desperate prison break with help from other enslaved species who had been inspired by human resistance to their own captivity. Zaravex High had been watching the prison compound and waiting for the right moment to act on feelings that had been growing stronger since the war began. The Nexari general remembered her own people proud history before they became auxiliaries in Valdorian conquest and decided that some things were more important than survival. She opened the prison doors and provided weapons to escaping prisoners, while her loyal troops stood guard against Valdorian security forces. Maya Rodriguez found herself leading a multi-species uprising as Alderos warriors remembered their forgotten courage, and Zenthari merchants recalled their lost independence. The rebellion spread across Ethermore as enslaved peoples rose against their masters and fought with desperate fury to reclaim their freedom. After centuries of subjugation, High Counselor Lirale watched her perfect empire crumble as species after species broke their chains and turned against the civilization that had claimed to protect them. She could not understand how inferior beings could reject the guidance and wisdom that had brought peace in order to the galaxy for 3,000 years. The High Counselor authorized the activation of the Stellar Disruption Array, which could destroy Earth's sun and eliminate humanity completely from the universe, but the weapon required constant maintenance from enslaved Nexori engineers who had been secretly sabotaging the system. Under Zaravek's high direction, Captain Martinez led the first human strike force to penetrate Valdorian core systems, and her ships fought through defensive fleets with tactics that had been refined through blood and sacrifice. Retribution shields held against enemy fire, while its weapons carved through Valdorian hulls like paper, and proved that human engineering could match anything the Empire possessed. Admiral Sullivan commanded the largest human fleet ever assembled as ships from every colony and outpost converged on Ethermore for the final battle. She broadcast a message to all human forces, reminding them of New Harmony and the billions of people who depended on their courage and determination. The Admiral spoke of children who deserved to grow up free, and of the promise that humanity had made to never bow down to tyrants regardless of their power or technology. Darmaya Rodriguez worked with Zara Vex High to coordinate sabotage operations across the Valdorian homeworld. While rebellion raged in the floating cities, they discovered that many Imperial systems depended on forced labor from conquered species, and that freeing these workers would cripple Valdorian military capabilities. The two women led teams through crystal corridors and anti-grav platforms, while explosions echoed across the sky and ancient tyranny finally faced its reckoning. Admiral Theron Nightblade found himself fighting a war unlike anything in Valdorian history, as human ships attacked with reckless courage, and alien auxiliaries switched sides. His perfect formations crumbled under assault from enemies who seemed to care more about inflicting damage than preserving their own lives. The Valdorian commander requested permission to retreat and regroup, but High Counselor Lirale refused to accept that the Empire could be defeated by primitive barbarians. Shy ordered him to fight to the last ship rather than admit that 3,000 years of conquest could be undone by one stubborn species. Captain Martinez pursued Valdorian ships through asteroid fields and nebulae. As the enemy fleet began to disintegrate under constant human pressure, her crew fought with mechanical precision born from grief and rage, and the knowledge that every enemy ship destroyed brought them closer to justice. For New Harmony, v. Retribution weapon systems overloaded from constant firing, but emergency repairs kept them operational. As the battle reached its climax, Amy Clark coordinated communication between human forces and rebel species while jamming Valdorian command networks to prevent organized resistance. Her broadcasts carried news of victories across the Empire as world after world threw off Valdorian control and joined the growing rebellion. The intelligence officer watched as the perfect order of Imperial civilization collapsed into chaos and civil war, and felt satisfaction at seeing tyrants face the consequences of their actions. Admiral Sullivan engaged the Valdorian flagship in personal combat, while her fleet swept aside escort vessels and carved through defensive formations. She spoke directly to Admiral Theron and told him that this was the price of underestimating humanity and believing that fear could conquer the human spirit. The final phase of battle began as human and rebel forces converged on Ithamor itself, while the Stellar Disruption Array prepared to fire at Earth. Zara Vex High led her sabotage team into the Weapon Control Center, where Nexari engineers waited to turn the device against Valdorian ships instead of the human. Homeworld High Counselor Lirale watched her empire die around her, and still could not comprehend how superior beings could be defeated by creatures she considered barely civilized. She prepared to flee with her remaining loyalists, but found her escape route blocked by Captain Martinez and a squadron of human ships that had been hunting her since New Harmony burn. The woman who had ruled the galaxy for 1,000 years faced the captain, whose world she had destroyed, and learned that some enemies would pursue justice across any distance. Captain Lisa Martinez stood on the bridge of the HSS Retribution as it closed distance with High Counselor Lirale escape ship, and felt the weight of 12 million souls demanding justice for their deaths. The Valdorian vessel tried to flee toward the outer system, but human pursuit ships had anticipated this move and cut off every escape route with precision that spoke of careful planning. Glorelli broadcast surrender offers and promises of negotiation, but Martinez responded with silence, because some crimes could not be forgiven through words alone. The counselor ship was trapped in a web of human vessels that had been hunting her across 3 star systems since the fall of Ethermore began. Meanwhile, Dr. Maya Rodriguez and Zara Vex High fought their way through the Stellar Disruption Array Control Center as Valdorian guards made their final stand. The massive weapon hummed with power that could destroy Earth's sun, but Nexari engineers had been preparing for this moment since the rebellion begins, shouted commands in her native language, and her people abandoned their posts at weapon systems and began rerouting power flows. According to plans they had hidden for months, the stellar disruption array turned slowly in space, as targeting computers were reprogrammed to aim at Valdorian fleet positions instead of the distant human homeworld. Admiral Theron, Nightblade, watched in horror as his own Empire ultimate weapon prepared to fire on his ships, and realized that the rebellion had corrupted every system he trusted. He tried to evacuate his remaining vessels, but the weapon fired before his fleet could escape, and Valdorian ships died in the light of their own. Superweapon High Counselor Lirelei felt her empire crumble as reports came in from across the galaxy of worlds, throwing off Imperial control and declaring independence. Perfect order she had maintained for 1,000 years dissolved into chaos as 40 species remembered their lost freedom and rose against their oppressors. Admiral Kate Sullivan coordinated the final assault on Ithamor as human and alien forces converged on the floating cities that had symbolized Valdorian power for millennia. Her ships moved through crystal spires and antigrav platforms while former slaves fought beside human marines to capture the seat of galactic tyranny. The Admiral broadcast a message to all remaining Valdorian forces offering surrender terms that were more generous than the Empire had ever shown its victims, but most Imperial troops fought to the end rather than face the humiliation of defeat at the hands of species they had considered inferior. Captain Martinez closed the final distance to Lirelei's ship and demanded the Counselor personal surrender for her crimes against humanity and other species. The Valdorian leader responded with confusion and anger as she struggled to understand how primitive barbarians could defeat a civilization that had ruled for 3,000 years. She spoke of bringing order to chaos and civilization to savage worlds and protecting weaker species from their own destructive impulses. Martinez listened to these justifications with cold fury and explained that freedom was worth more than safety, and that no species had the right to enslave another. The final confrontation took place aboard Lirelei flagship as human marines fought through elegant corridors toward the command center, where the Counselor waited. Lirelei faced Captain Martinez in the crystal throne room surrounded by the artwork and treasures stolen from 40 conquered civilizations. The High Counselor could not comprehend how humans had destroyed her perfect empire and still believed that superior beings should naturally rule inferior ones. Martinez looked at the woman who had ordered the destruction of New Harmony and felt no hatred anymore, but only the cold certainty that justice demanded payment. The Counselor fell without dignity or understanding as the last symbol of Valdorian supremacy died in the ruins of her crystalline palace. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the news of Imperial collapse spread like wildfire as liberated worlds celebrated their freedom after centuries of oppression. Emmy Clark coordinated communication networks that carried messages of joy and relief from species that had never dared to hope for independence. The former slaves of the Valdorian Empire began the long process of rebuilding their cultures and remembering the traditions that had been systematically erased. Dr. Maya Rodriguez worked with provisional governments to establish medical aid for species that had been genetically modified and needed help returning to their natural states. Ravex high-led Nexari forces in hunting down the last Valdorian loyalists who refused to accept that their empire of 3 millennia had fallen to human determination. Admiral Sullivan accepted the surrender of remaining Imperial forces and began organizing trials for war criminals who had participated in genocide and enslavement. President Helen Carter arrived at Ithamor aboard the diplomatic vessel HSS New Harmony to oversee the establishment of democratic institutions on the former imperial capital. She met with representatives from all 40 liberated species to discuss forming a new galactic alliance based on cooperation rather than conquests. President spoke of learning from past mistakes and ensuring that no single species could ever again dominate others through force or deception. Captain Martinez stood in the ruins of the Crystal Palace and remembered the faces of everyone who had died defending human freedom and felt their sacrifice had been worthwhile. She placed a memorial plaque, made from metal salvaged from New Harmony, that bore the names of the 12 million civilians who had died in Valdorian attacks. The inscription read simply that they had fallen because they were free, and that their deaths had purchased liberty for countless others across the galaxy. 1 year later, Dr. Maya Rodriguez taught xenobiology at the new Galactic University on Ethamor, where former enemies learned together about cooperation and mutual respect. Her students included young humans and Valdorians and members of dozens of species who were discovering what it meant to live without fear of oppression. The university library contained archives from all member species, with their histories and cultures preserved as they actually existed rather than imperial propaganda versions. Sullivan commanded the Democratic Alliance fleet, which protected trade routes and responded to distress calls, but never imposed its will on sovereign worlds. She worked closely with Zara Vex High, who had become the first non-human admiral in Alliance history, and brought her experience fighting tyranny to their shared mission. Captain Martinez served as director of the Memorial Foundation, which honored all species that had been destroyed by imperial conquest over 3,000 years. The Foundation worked to preserve the memory of lost civilizations and ensure that future generations would remember the price of allowing tyrants to gain power. Amy Clark established the Free Communication Network, which connected all Alliance worlds without censorship or surveillance and promoted open exchange of ideas. Her system enabled small voices to be heard across the galaxy and prevented any single authority from controlling the flow of information. President Carter signed the Galactic Freedom Charter alongside representatives from 47 species and created the framework for lasting peace. Based on mutual respect, the charter guaranteed the right of self-determination for all sentient beings and established courts to prosecute crimes against sapient species. On a memorial wall in the center of New Geneva Settlement, the names of every human who died fighting for freedom were carved in stone that would last forever. Below their names was a simple message that spoke to the heart of human nature and explained why the Valdorian Empire had fallen. Read that some prey fights back, and that freedom is worth any price, and that no empire can stand against people who refuse to be slaves. 3 other galactic powers received detailed reports about human military capabilities and the fall of the Valdorian Empire, and quietly cancelled their own expansion plans. The Andromedans recalled their scout fleets from human space and decided that perhaps conquest was not as profitable as they had previously believed. The hegemony of worlds reviewed their subjugation protocols and concluded that some species were too dangerous to provoke regardless of potential benefits. Even the ancient observers, who had watched civilizations rise and fall for 10,000 years, took note of humanity and marked them as a species to be approached with caution. The galaxy had learned that empires fall when they forget that some beings value freedom more than life and that human determination could overcome any odds. Humanity had stepped onto the galactic stage, not as conquerors, but as liberators, and had proven that justice could triumph over tyranny. When people refused to surrender, the Valdorian Empire had made the same error as every failed civilization before them, and had discovered too late that they had provoked the wrong species.